16. Achilleos woke with a start. He reached for his clothes, throwing them on as quickly as he could. Then, snatching the bow and quiver from a nearby chair, the archer heard not a sound, but something set him on edge. He crept toward the door, pausing there to listen. At first, all was silence, but then Achilleos heard faint movement, either of someone very slight or very sure-footed. Looping the bow over his shoulder, he retrieved the hunting knife he always carried on his belt. Then, with the utmost caution, Achilleos opened the door a crack. The dim light of a single weak oil lamp mounted on the wall gave his expert eyes just enough illumination to see down the corridor. Someone moved at the very edge of the lit area, but not a figure tall enough to be Master Ethan or one of the household servants. In fact, it looked like young Cedric to him. The boy slowly moved along, pausing now and then before various doors. He stopped in front of the one leading to Seraphina's chambers, then moved on. For some reason that caused Achilleos to exhale in relief. What exactly the merchant's son was doing, the archer had no idea. There was nothing normal in Cedric's behavior. Achilleos began to fear that the boy's mind might not be alright. Or that, considering the events of the recent past, something or someone had control of it. That decided it for him. Moving as silent as a cat, Achilleos stepped out into the corridor. He kept the knife ready. For what he did not know. Not to use against the poor boy, certainly. Ethan's son wasn't innocent. Cedric continued to study the doors, but also peered at alcoves and even, at times, the ceiling. Achilleos wondered what he expected to find above, then decided he would prefer not to know. Eyes well adjusted to the dimness, the archer kept pace with his unsuspecting quarry. Achilleos reached Seraphina's door. He hesitated there, leaning his ear close. Within, the soft sounds of her steady breathing reassured him that she was unharmed. Straightening, Achilleos focused on Cedric again. Or would have, if the youth had been anywhere to be seen. Somehow, in the brief seconds when the archer's attention had been on Seraphina's safety, Cedric had vanished from his view. Frowning, Achilleos pushed forward. Master Ethan's son had to be somewhere ahead, unless he had managed to slip into one of the last rooms without Achilleos noticing. That was highly unlikely. The hunter could not have missed such an obvious action. But as he neared the end, it seemed to Achilleos that entering a room was the only possibility to explain Cedric's disappearance. Yet, the most likely of the doors proved locked, and surely he would have heard the rattling of the handle. A few more steps took Achilleos to the far wall. Perplexed, he ran a hand across the area, thinking that perhaps there was a hidden door. Unfortunately, he discovered nothing. The wall was very, very solid. Then, some inner alarm made him look up at the ceiling, only to find that, while it was dark there was also empty of any nightmare. Achilleos frowned, briefly wondering why he had suddenly felt as if danger had lurked above him. So perplexed by Cedric's disappearance, he turned back. Master Ethan stood only a yard away from him, gazing up solemnly at the tall archer. Achilleos all but jumped. Said! I was looking for her, the youth remarked quietly and steadily. The one with old Diason. Lila, you mean? Why would she? Lila, Cedric repeated, almost as if memorizing it. Do you know where she is? I'd imagine with old Diason, as you said, lad. Achilles chuckled. But I'd not disturb them now. Would probably be very inopportune. She's not with him. And how would you know that? For reasons he could not explain, the archer suddenly felt very cold. Achilles leaned toward the boy. Said, are you all... Master Ethan's son shoved him against the wall with such force that the hunter felt the wood crack. Giving silent thanks that it had not been his bones that had made such a sound, Achilles let himself drop to the floor. Just above his head, Cedric slammed a fist into the wall, wreaking further damage in a manner impossible for one his size. Or even Achilles' for that matter. The hunter kicked out, hoping to knock his attacker off balance, but it was as if Achilles struck solid rock. The impact vibrated through his body. Cedric appeared unaffected. In fact, Achilles could almost swear that the boy smiled at his puny effort. As the small figure reached for him, the hunter reprimanded himself for still thinking that it was the merchant's son with whom he battled. This was not Cedric. This was possibly not even anything human. Achilles recalled too well the demons in the wild. Surely this had to be one of them. With an agility born from keeping on the trails of most wily animals, Achilles managed to avoid the grasping hands. He shoved himself forward, slipping past the false Cedric. Unfortunately, as the hunter tried to get to his feet, one hand finally snagged him by the collar. With a triumphant grunt, Cedric threw Achilles down the corridor. Achilles landed hard, but the sound of his collision was oddly muffled. He doubted that anyone other than he could have even heard it. Clearly another spell at work, and one that which concerned Achilles as much as the creature masquerading as the boy. It meant that an army, led by the high priest Malik, of course, could walk the entire house, and no one would even know until it was too late. The villains would be after old Dyson. It was possible that they even had him captive already. But why then would they want Lila? You can only assume that either he was wrong and his friend had escaped the high priest's grasp, which meant that they wanted to use the noble woman for bait, or old Dyson was a prisoner, as Achilles had first supposed, and Lila was to force him to remain compliant. But whatever the reason, she had not been with him. Achilles gave thanks for that stroke of luck, even as he scurried to his feet to avoid being fallen upon by his assailant. Her escape meant there remained some hope. He had no more time to concern himself with old Dyson and Lila, for suddenly Cedric wielded in his hand a pair of vicious swords, nearly the length of his body. Achilles had no idea where those weapons had come from, but the creature used them with tremendous skill, cutting arcs in the air and through a wooden railing too near. Fragments of wood went flying. There was also something else different about the figure before Achilles. He was larger, bloated, as if something sought to burst free from under the skin. The cold Achilles had felt within grew worse as he imagined the fate of the boy whom he had befriended. The boy who had wanted to be an expert hunter, just like him. Jagged tears spread over Cedric's face and form. The right side near the jaw snapped away, revealing underneath something as pale as death and clad in black metal. What had once been Master Ethan's son now stood nearly as tall as Achilles, and wider yet. And even as the transformation took place, the blades came at the archer. Achilleus dodged one after another, barely even able to draw a breath between leaps. Most other men would have long been cut to shreds, and he knew that one lapse would see him dead. His concern was not so much for himself as it was for the rest, and he worried what would happen to Seraphina and Madeline if he failed. He dared not even warn them for fear that they would step out of the rooms and be slain. For that matter, it was possible that they might not even be able to hear his cry, if what he suspected about a spell was true. One of the blades sank deep into the rail again, this time momentarily catching. The hesitation was all Achilleus needed. His knife he had lost when smashing it against the wall, but with practiced ease, the archer slipped free his bow and notched an arrow. At such a range, he could hardly miss, but the exact target was what mattered. This was surely a fiend similar to what had attacked Dyson in the street, and so merely firing for a vital spot would not necessarily work. In fact, there was only one place Achilleus was fairly sure would have any effect. All this went through his mind in a matter of a single second, and the next Achilleus fired, aiming for one of the eyes. They now had an ominous darkness to them, as if there were no pupils, merely sockets. Still, the thing had to see. He should have easily hit the spot. Even the creature seemed to think that, for it moved the twin blades up to protect the face. Yet, not only did the arrow miss the area of the eye, it flew entirely against all logic, burying itself deep in the wall beside his foe. The bestial figure laughed. It tore away the last of poor Cedric's countenance and, as it did, expanded in height and girth again, becoming an armored giant upon whose head was a macabre helmet that looked like an animal's skull. Swearing, Achilleus stumbled back a step and notched another arrow. Keeping the last bolt's direction in mind, he fired again. This time, it bounced off the armored shoulder. The fearsome warrior grinned.
Not so good.
He mocked in a voice that sent shivers through Achilleus, for it sounded of the grave and reminded the archer of that moment when he had touched the stone near Sarum.
Not so good for you.
The blades came like twin whirlwinds. This time, Achilleus moved too slowly. One cut into his thigh. He let out a cry and fell to the floor.
You would make a good warrior.
The armored behemoth grated.
Not as good as I, Damos, but still good. Maybe I bring your body back for the master.
He raised both swords. From behind Deimos, someone quietly spoke. Achilleus thought he'd recognize the voice, and yet at the same time, there was that about it that made it sound as unnatural as when the Morlu had spoken. The huge warrior jerked, as if a puppet tugged by the strings. With a hiss, he spun to face whatever stood there. Achilles reached for his bow, but did not know where to fire. The only open area was near the neck, a target where his arrow had failed to slay the last time.
Who are you?
Demanded Deimos.
What is it you speak?
The other said, something in a tongue Achilleus did not recognize. The Morlu let out a howl. He doubled over, dropping one of his swords.
Stop it! Stop!
Deimos lunged with the remaining weapon, only to come up short. He gasped, then fell to one knee. The second sword joined its brother. The dark figure beyond the Morlu uttered a single syllable. Deimos let out a howl. His body, shivered. The stench suddenly arose from around the Morley's direction. A carrion smell. With a last mournful sound, the armored giant collapsed in an ungainly pile. The stench grew stronger. Covering his nose and mouth, Achilles stared at the one standing over the body. Mandolin? Eldyson's brother stared at Achilles as if seeing through him. There was a presence around Mandolin that made the hunter shiver, almost as much as when he had realized what had become of Cedric. It was not evil, but so different. And it once more put Achilles in mind of the stone and what he had felt. Cry I train, how disgay. Mandolin finally said to him, as if this gibberish explained anything. Rising, Achilles glanced at the Morlu. From the smell and what he could glimpse, he would have sworn that the creature had been dead for many days, even weeks. The flesh almost seemed to be petrifying before his very eyes. He looked again at Mandolin, pale as the corpse. The younger brother suddenly blinked. Life returned to his expression, followed a moment later by utter bewilderment and horror at the tableau before him. Achilles? What? Where? At that moment, the house filled with noise. There was a crash and voices both below and nearby. A tremendous thud came from the direction of the chamber shared by Eldys and Lila, a place that the archer had assumed vacant from the false Cedric's remarks. A door nearby flung open, and Serenthina, a dressing gown given to her by Master Ethon, closed tightly around her throat, burst out. She saw Achilles first, then Mandolin, and finally noticed the grisly form on the floor. To her credit, the trader's daughter smothered a cry and instead immediately asked, "Where's Eldys and Lila? Are they all right?" Before Achilles could answer, there came another crash, this one from the very direction of Eldys' chamber. The hunter spun around and headed toward the noise. As Serenthina started to follow, he shouted, "You two stay! Do as I say!" He had no idea whether they obeyed or not, but hoped that at least Mandolin would have the good sense to keep Cyrus's daughter out of danger. How Mandolin had done what he had to the vicious Morlu, Achilles did not understand. Nor did he understand exactly what had happened to the creature, but hopefully that same power would come into play if they were attacked. There was no telling how many more of the foul warriors there still were. Two guards raced up the steps, obviously heading for the same destination. The first to reach the door gripped the handle. From the chamber next to old Dyson, the massive form of a Morlu burst through into the hall. He rammed into the two startled guards, sending one falling down the stairs. The second tried to turn to fight, but the monstrous warrior cut through his chest with an axe, spilling blood everywhere. The corpse went tumbling back, the eyes of the hapless guard ending up staring at Achilles. The archer already had his bow unslung and ready to fire, but he remained well aware how his previous attempts had failed. With a swift calculation honed by having to adjust for a wind, the sudden darting of animals, he finally released the arrow. By all logic, the bolt should have flown far past his target, but it swerved at the last, just as Achilles hoped. He was certain that some spell had been cast on his weapon, although when that might have happened, he could not say. The only one other than him to touch it of late had been Eldys and Master Ethon. The shaft had buried itself exactly where he hoped. The Morlu let out a cry, a howl, as he reached to pluck the arrow from one of the dark eye sockets. Achilles had his second shot ready by then. He fired immediately and watched with grim satisfaction as the new arrow hit directly in the other's socket. The armored behemoth slumped to his knees. The hand pulling at the first arrow dropped loosely to the floor, followed by the one wielding the bloody axe. Yet the Morlu did not completely collapse. Racing up to the fiendish warrior, Achillio snagged the axe. The Morlu weakly sought to grab at him. Thunder dodged. Then Bo looped over his shoulder, raised the axe high. A moment later, he let it sink deep into the Morlu's neck, cutting the head off cleanly. Only then did the body fall forward. Keeping the axe ready, Achilles looked to old Dyson's door. To his dismay, Sarantina, a sharp, broken piece of railing in one hand, already stood there, Mandolin on her heels. I told you to stay. Heedless of his warning, she flung open the door. Achilles leaped after her, fearful for her life. As they entered, it was to see old Dyson and another Morlu with their hands around another's throat. Sarantina let out a gasp, then ran up behind the Morlu. Achilles expected her to try to club him with a piece of wood, but instead, she turned it point first and aimed for the back of the neck. By right, he should have cut harmlessly, or at most caused some shallow wound. Yet, as Sarantina thrust it with all of her might, the point flared white and sank into the Morlu's flesh with the utmost ease. Old Dyson's adversary hacked, releasing his hold. The Morlu tried to pull the rail free. He fell to his knees, clutching desperately at it. Sarantina stepped back, obviously awed by what she had done. Old Dyson, on the other hand, simply bent down over the Morlu, then seized the wood. With powerful effort, he twisted it so that it nearly tore the head off. The Morlu dropped. The head is the key, old Dyson declared. The head. He looked up. Lila, is she with you? No, Sarantina quickly responded. One of these creatures was looking for her. Achilles added. You seem to be having no luck in this area. I don't understand. Unless... He pushed past them, shouting, she must have gone to look for me. She must have headed to the study, where I last left Malik. Mandolin did not follow after his brother and the others as they rushed to rescue the noblewoman. It was that he did not wish to help, but something made him pause and look again at the Morlu. Both the one just slain and the other in the hall. A sense of foreboding rose with him as he moved to the nearest. He almost felt that, despite appearances, some spark of animation, not life, remained in the hideous corpse. Without knowing why, he stretched a hand out over the back of the body. In his head, symbols appeared. This time Mandolin had some vague understanding of what they meant, and, as with times previous, the pronunciation was obvious to him. As he said the words, he felt a coolness emanate from his downturned palm. A faint glow, like moonlight, shone down on the region below his hand. The Morlu's body shivered almost as if intending to rise again. It was all Mandolin could do to keep from pulling away. Yet some inner sense warned him that if he did, it might prove catastrophic. The Morlu's corpse shook violently. Then a black cloud, no larger than an apple, rose from the body. It hovered briefly, then drifted up into his palm, where it promptly dissipated. The Morlu stilled again. The corpse looked as if it had deflated some. Mandolin no longer sensed anything. He went to the next one in the corridor and performed the same ritual. Glancing over his shoulder, Mandolin eyed the first one that he had encountered with Achilleos. He could still not recall how he had gone from his bed to the hall and why that Morlu had fallen at his feet. All that Mandolin knew for certain was that he had uttered words to that one, which made it unnecessarily to perform the ritual used on the pair. Curiously, Mandolin also suddenly recalled that he had not felt alone when he had dealt with the creature. He could have sworn that there had been a figure behind him, someone who had first whispered the needed words just in time. But who? Mandolin asked himself. Who? Then he remembered that there might be more of the Helmed Warriors, either those in wait or those believed dead. Whichever the case, Mandolin knew that he had to see to each of them, make certain that the ritual was done. Only then could it be ensured that none would rise again. Shivering at the thought, old Ison's brother hurried along. It had to be the study. Somehow, old Ison knew that Lila had gone there. She would have entered without hesitation, certain that her love and Master Ethan were inside, discussing some matter. Malik would take her, then use her as leverage against the Senate Demedes. He knew that old Dyson would do anything to save her from harm. Old Dyson's blood suddenly boiled. But if she was harmed? The doors to the study were shut. That seemed very odd, considering that now household servants and guards ran all through the building, trying to make some sense of what had happened. That none of them had gone to the study in search of their employer boded ill, for it smelled of the cleric's manipulations. His thoughts growing more turbulent, old Dyson threw himself at the entrance. The doors crashed open, one flying back so hard that it broke off. Old Dyson landed on the floor, immediately rolling to his feet and trying to muster whatever he could from within. "Malik!" he roared, awaiting the worst. "This is between you and I!" But is he drinking the sight before him? Old Dyson faltered. There was another Morlu in the center of the study, his head cleanly separated from his body, and a dark, burnt area across his chest. The head, still within the ram skull helmet, seemed to peer angrily at the ceiling. That scene, though, was nothing compared with what lay sprawled a little farther inside. It was another corpse, stripped cleanly of its flesh, blood spilling from 1,000 ripped veins. The body was tall, athletic and built, as ruined muscle and sinew still managed to indicate, and somehow yet clad despite its flaying. It was the body of Malik. high priest of the Order of Memphis.